Some people say that in comedy timing is everything. I would say that in asteroid resources, timing is everything just as much. This work is about astrodynamics, finance and investment, and how the entire thing works together and fits together basically. So there are certain gaps in communication between the aerospace industry and the mining industry and the financial sector. The key terminology evolves around astrodynamics. So from a traditional perspective, astrodynamics is typically about analyzing and optimizing a single transfer. A spacecraft flies to an asteroid or maybe to a planet. So we are looking at a single transfer, a single leg. In a worst case scenario, let's say in a more complex scenario from a research perspective, we may have a sample return. So we fly to the body, we take a sample and we fly back. For asteroid resources, the entire picture becomes somewhat more complex. We are interested in flying not only once, but multiple times. We have to transfer equipment, we have to explore the object, and of course we have to return products or material. So there's a new term that emerges and that we have to look and understand and sell to the right people, and that's sequences of operations. A sequence always has multiple parts, multiple moving parts, and this is where time matters the most. So what is this work not about? Let's look at a few questions here. The first question is, of course, is exploiting asteroid resources feasible? Let's just say for the purpose of this discussion, yes it is. The second question is, are there markets? And of course, where to deliver the product? Let's just say there is a market, or the market is currently emerging, as we can clearly agree on. And the market will probably be somewhere in the Earth-Moon system. The third question we may ask is, what are resource types, or what are the actual products? We could say that there are two kinds of products, material and fuel, but I wouldn't go any deeper from the perspective of this work. The fourth question basically is, how about legislation? Can we protect an asteroid in space? The question is sort of in some countries it's possible, and there are international agreements emerging. It's not perfect yet, but there's progress clearly in sight. The final question is there data? From a scientific perspective, there's plenty of data on asteroids, so this question can be considered solved, more or less. Now, having said scientific data, we still have to look at what the state of the solar system is as we know it. We know a lot of data. We have a lot of data, we know a lot of parameters, and some of them can be seen in the background on a list. We have a population of roughly 1 million asteroids. About 20,000 of those are classified as near-Earth asteroids. It's kind of an arbitrary border between what a near-Earth asteroid is and what an asteroid is, so I don't like this division. So let's just say we have asteroids. Of some of those asteroids we know the taxonomy, let's say the spectral class. Of some of those asteroids we know the spin state or the shape and the size. But if we look at how many asteroids have been characterized perfectly, it's actually a very, very small number. From an economic perspective, it's not perfect. So all we really know is we have 1 million objects, and few of those are perfectly characterized from an economic perspective. So what this means at the end of the day is, if we want to exploit them, we have to look at them way more closely than has ever been done before. So let's remember, in the beginning I said timing is everything. So we have to basically go back to time and understand the economics of the entire thing. We have to explore, we have to exploit, and we have to sell a product. So how can we go forward from here? I suggest that we model the entire thing. And by modeling I mean we have to optimize for certain kind of parameters. Most people ask, what is the revenue? What is the value of the objects? How much money can we make? And that's actually the real question at the end of the day, yes, but it is too early to ask this question. I suggest that we look at one step in between. We have to look at cost, we have to look at risk, and of course we have to look at time. If we drive up the risk, we can reduce the time, of course. If we drive up the cost, we can reduce time and risk, and so on and so forth. So we can basically understand how to start this entire kind of economy. So what I have in modeling is essentially a system of risk, of time, total required time, starting with exploration and ending with the product, and of course the cost of the entire campaign. In every model we have to look at the parameter space. Now with 1 million objects, the parameter space in this case is incredibly huge. So from a pure computation perspective, it doesn't make sense to look for specific strategies to make this entire thing fast. So I chose a brute force approach. I'm simply testing different strategies, different procedures, different timelines, different investments at different points in time against the entire population of asteroids. It's by far the fastest method, and if you look at the time to build a model and the time to compute it, nowadays with modern computing resources, brute force is just way faster. Since we have been talking about models, we have to understand what the architecture of a campaign is and what components of a campaign or the model are. So when we basically want to exploit an asteroid, we can first start with looking at the asteroid with Earth-based equipment. So basically using optical telescopes and radar installations. Combined, they can tell us a lot about the shape, the chemistry, the size of the object, whether it spins or not, what kind of structure it has. But it doesn't tell us the big picture, or all of the big picture. So there are a few more components, and those are missions. We may and should actually fly to the asteroid. Of course, there are flyby missions, so we fly past the asteroid with a certain high relative speed and gather some insights from close up. We can of course also rendezvous with the asteroid and stay there for a longer period of time, take samples, do some geophysical analysis, and even take samples for eventual return back to Earth. At the end, it's a combination of those tools and aspects that enables an entire exploration campaign. So the question is, which of those components are relevant and which can be skipped depending on the time frame you have, on the risk and the amount of resources you want to invest. The commonly forgotten component here is simply idle time and waiting time. Let's say you have used a certain opportunity to fly to an asteroid. A good opportunity with low delta V doesn't occur very often. So you may have to wait for another 5 to 10 years, maybe even 20 or 30 years before you can fly to the asteroid again. And the same applies to observations. An asteroid that has been observable from Earth may not be in a good position to be visited by a spacecraft in the next 10 years. It may also be. So what really matters at the end of the day is the amount of waiting time, the amount of idle time in between those components, not just the components themselves. There are basically different types of sequences that we can imagine. We could say that we start with an optical observation and we do flyby, and then we go directly to the exploitation of the object. We could also imagine that we do the entire campaign. We start with optical and radar observations, do flybys, do rendezvous, and once we have sufficient data, after maybe 20 years, we start exploiting the object. Different types of sequences make sense given different constraints in terms of cost, time, and risk. Testing different strategies against the entire asteroid population results in groups of asteroids responding very well to certain strategies, while the remaining population doesn't. Which is kind of interesting because those groups don't necessarily correspond to the conventional scientific orbit classification system that we are all used to. So what I propose instead is to use a new economic orbit classification system. If you look at those groups, you can even apply fuzzing. It means that you are looking at those orbits of those known objects that respond well to a certain strategy, and you are looking randomly for close orbits that kind of also make sense. So what comes to mind when we look at this model and the groups of asteroids is the fact that we can treat asteroids as assets. Assets that can be traded between different companies who specialize in certain parts of those sequences. Companies specializing maybe in optical observation or into exploration campaigns. If we apply the trading principle here, we can massively reduce the risk and we can much more easily deal with longer time spans and investments. So one last question that typically remains is the question of how to protect an asteroid in space as a claim, as a natural resource claim, basically. As said, it's not possible right now, at least not internationally. So there are kind of two basic questions. First, is there competition? Do we actually need to protect an asteroid? I would say there may be competition pretty soon, so it may be worth looking into it. The second question is, how can we do it? And if we completely neglect the idea of trading assets between different companies, it is certainly possible, and that's what my model also shows, to hide the location of a target asteroid. But this can only happen under the condition that you keep it quite secret, and it should basically happen all from one single company. So while possible, that's, I guess, not the future. My name is Sebastian Ernst. I have backgrounds in geophysics and aerospace engineering. Nowadays, I consult on handling large quantities of data, analyzing them, and high-performance computing. The presented work is work in progress. If you're interested in more and updates and future findings, please follow me on social media.